Hello, BookTube. These are grim and war-torn days in our once peaceful little corner of BookTube. The OGBG haul wars have expanded on all sides. They have spilled over their original borders. Their savagery knows no bounds. Some of you may have seen Todd at Todd's Bursting Bookcase made a video, the first one in a long time, specifically so that he could re-enter the fray. And the sound in that video of two cats viciously going at each other, as cats will do, why people keep these creatures as pets, I have no idea, is the sound of the OGBG haul wars. Peg at the history shelf, I love Peg so much. Well, yeah, she's so nice, except when she wages war. She made a haul video, ably abetted by her #1 collaborator, Martine, and with a thumbnail that had not only a little dog, but a little miniature schnauzer. She made a haul video, and of course, let's not leave out Bill Rutenberg from the peaceful cornfields of Iowa. He had to join the fray, went out on a mega haul. Country's in the middle of a crippling, once-in-a-century pandemic. You'd never know it from all this book shopping going on. Sean Standfast, over in England. He's not only been made redundant, but he's under an ironclad lockdown. Still managed to get books, though. Still manages to talk about books in a video. And leave us not forget the #1 aggressor. I think Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads is perhaps on his 5th straight day of book hauls. And to make matters worse, as if Peg's betrayal weren't enough, putting a miniature schnauzer in her thumbnail, in one of Mark's latest book hauls, he went to Queechee, a sprawling, great antiques mart that used to be our special place. He went there without me. He probably got a whole bunch of Legion of Superheroes back issues and didn't tell anybody. And the only glimmer of peace that any of us have had in all of this unending nightmare of artillery bombardments has been the absence of Jason Harrigan. and yet, how long will that stay true? How long will the dragon stay in its lair? He was the original instigator of all this. He, too, is under lockdown. But he's wily. He's a wily sort of thing. You never want to turn your back on a Benedictine. They're the worst. He could easily re-enter the fray, so I thought it was only my duty to go back to the Brattle Bookshop in Boston. I had an appointment bitterly early this morning, and when it was done, I was in perfect striking distance of the Brattle Bookshop. Those of you who are new to the channel, it's a great used bookstore in the heart of downtown Boston. It not only has a big hopping store, destination enough, but also a gigantic lot full of thousands of sale books for $1, $3, and $5. So you can go, and with spending comparatively little money, you can get a big armload of books. And I did that. I did that today. So I want to show you them. The first one is a trade paperback. I usually don't do that. It was dirt cheap. Otherwise, I might not have, because a trade paperback is probably not going to be a keeper. And my whole goal now with printed paper books, something as anachronistic as a printed paper book, is to get keepers, stuff that will fill out these shelves and then stay here. But I got this paperback anyway. It was dirt cheap, and I have never actually read all the way through it. I've read bits and pieces of the books that are excerpted and comprised in here, but I've never read the whole of this. This is from the journals of MFK Fisher. There's our author on the cover, a truly great writer of the 20th century, known for her food writing. Serve it forth and consider the oyster and whatnot. But a great writer at anything that she turned her pen to. And these are journals and personal reflections, some of which were written for publication, others of which were not. This is bound to be an amazing, amazing reading experience. And if it's a paperback and I finish being amazed by it and don't feel like it's a keeper, I can always just recycle it. I can send it back to the Brattle, or I can send it out to one of you. Then this next one, in the aforementioned Q&A, one of you was asking about Will and Ariel Durant's History of Civilization series, the big 15-book series. The books are also really big, and they got bigger as they went along, where the two of them just went through, they go through history and tell it in a big narrative style. It's incredibly entertaining to read. And fairly scrupulous in its scholarship for the time. This was half a century ago. The whole set of the History of Civilization is an education all by itself. Incredible in that way, just incredible. And you'll never find a multi-book series this big that's more readable. And during that Q&A, I mentioned that. I mentioned that, for instance, if you're interested in Voltaire, there is a volume called The Age of Voltaire in the History of Civilization, and I found it in a copy that is as new as the day it was printed. And I have these. I have all of these as ebooks. But I am perfectly willing to admit there is still a pleasure in the serendipity of a printed book, and also in the heft of actually holding in your hand. And this is not just a biography of Voltaire, although as a biography of Voltaire, it's one of the best ones that I've read in English. But in addition to that, it ranges all over the place. This is the Europe of Bach. This is the England of King George, of the Georges, 1, 2, and especially 3. This is the Europe of not only Voltaire, but Diderot. And they're all in here. It's just, I remember this being a tremendously readable experience, just like all the volumes in this series. And this one has the advantage of covering a lot of ground that I don't do really well, a lot of ground that isn't as well known to me. I haven't read this in forever, probably 40 years. So when I saw a copy for dirt cheap, I grabbed it, even though it's unlikely that I will keep it. I might send it out to one of you, but I doubt that I'll hold on to it forever. But the serendipity could not be denied. And then there's this next one. This next one came out about 15 years ago and flew under my radar for quite a bit of time, even though it's a spot-on subject. It's something that shouldn't have flown underneath my radar. This is Sean Wilentz, who's a fantastic, first-rate historian, wrote a couple of really big books that are really good. And this is a shorter one called The Age of Reagan, which is a lot about Reagan. The Reagan's initial presidential run is perfectly captured in here, for instance. That's well-trod ground. That has been gone over many, many times. There are a couple of great books on that particular campaigning season, Reagan and Carter and John Anderson. But this also makes pretense of being a broader history of late 20th century conservatism. Not just Reagan, but the things for which he ended up being a kind of halfway figurehead, and for which he is now totally inaccurately remembered, synonymous with stuff that he didn't believe and that he didn't really stand for at the time. It's just he assumed almost immediately a mythological status in the conservative movement. And that was true for the whole length of the modern conservative movement, even when it was first subverted by Newt Gingrich and then destroyed by Donald Trump. So there isn't the phenomenon that gets its history in this book doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to make this interesting in a way that it wouldn't have been for me 15 years ago. Plus, if I remember correctly, in his introduction, I think that's about as far as I got whenever I got into this book. In his introduction, in his opening remarks, I think Wilentz mentions that Reagan has not been adequately studied, that the Reagan era has not been adequately studied. And I kind of agree with that. I think that is still true, even after all this time. This thing came out in about 10 years ago, is that right? 2008. So I have not seen it. Considering his importance in history, there ought to be a major Reagan biography every year, and there isn't. So much less exhaustive studies of his administration. That doesn't happen except in specialty presses. So I grabbed it. It's a work of history, quite a few works of history here, history and biography. This next one is an author that I love. A lot of you will know him. A lot of you may have tried reading some of his enormous books and realized how painless he makes it. He makes it really easy to do. The author is Michael Schmidt, who did The Lives of the Poets and the History of the Novel and a whole bunch of other stuff. And this is a book of his that I have not read. I missed this completely. This is the first poets, the lives of the ancient Greek poets. So not just Homer and Hesiod, but a whole bunch of people you've never heard of, we have quite a bit of information about them. But they've never received modern narrative treatment. Here, the map gives us a location, not of places, but of the people. Those are where all the people come from. And they each get a chapter in here. And I already know, as a lot of you will know, from Lives of the Poets, for instance, how much fun this author is, how pleasant he is to read. You read him about anything. I would read him on any subject. Most of these poets are lost, unless you're a real big fan of the Greek anthology. Most of these poets are lost to immortality. They're known to scholars. And it's not going to matter. I know it's not going to matter at all. This is one of the only things I got today that goes straight on the reading list. I mean, right away. That isn't going to be on the shelf and, process it, mark it, inventory it, and then get around to it. I'm going to read this today. It's such a treat to find a book by an author that I love that I never actually got around to reading. I'll clean it up and read it today. And then we also have a little more. Next, we have a little more ancient Greek history. This one, I admit, is a little more up my alley because this is just a series of biographies, and I love biography. This is a book. This next one is one that I've had many times before. I had the advanced copy. I had the finished copy. I wrote a review, I believe. I think I did. And then I got the paperback, and I think I hurled it from me in disgust because it did not have my blurb on it. I don't know if that's true. I think that's true. And I've given away 80 million copies of this thing because people ask about this subject, and the only other alternative is not always palatable to people. This is the Peloponnesian War by Don Kagan. His soup to nuts narrative history of Athens versus Sparta. So when the war was hot, the long periods when it was cold, and like I mentioned, the only other alternative to this is to hand somebody Thucydides, and that doesn't always work. Even a history fan, that doesn't always work. And there's only one other soup to nuts, vaguely popular version of this on this subject, and it's not as readable, nowhere near as readable. This is terrific popular history, and I haven't read this in forever. This came out. I don't think this came out. This came out in 2003. I don't think I've read it since then. So, high time, almost 10 years. This next one. I remember when this came out. I read it when it came out. I loved it when it came out, and I wanted a piece of it when it came out. But it came out when I was not reviewing books. Those of you who are new to the channel, I reviewed books for anybody whose check wouldn't bounce, and for plenty of people whose checks did bounce for a long time in the American Midwest. And then I stopped for reasons surpassing understanding. I stopped and became a bookseller for 25 years. So I had an interruption in my career, if you want to call it that, or I had a second career that was longer than a lot of you have been alive. And then I moved back into reviewing books, where I intend to stay, lodged like a tick behind the ear for the rest of my life. I'm not going to go. I would hope that I'm not going to go back to any kind of retail job, but especially selling books. I would hope that I would do that. But that left a long interregnum. There was a long period where I read everything new. Once you're in that habit, you really don't get out of it. I only dropped that habit when I was traveling. Otherwise, I was always interested in new releases. Maybe not now. Now, my ratio is like 98%. And when I wasn't a reviewer, that wasn't true. But the ratio was still really high. It was still well over 50%. Which meant that when I was working at a bookstore, I was funneling most of my take-home pay into just buying books, even with a discount. But when this thing came out, this was one of the ones that really tempted me to write a review. Only at the time, in the late 1990s, I was under the impression that maybe I didn't know how anymore. That maybe I had lost the knack. I wasn't sure that wasn't true until I was invited to write my first review in all that 20 years, and realized that no, it's just like falling off a bicycle and then getting up and criticizing the bicycle. And that is this. That is by Robin Gardner and Dan Vanderwaat. This is the Titanic Conspiracy, and it digs in. It tells the story of the sinking of the HMS Titanic, but it also digs into all sorts of questions. What are some of the questions here? Why was the ship's helmsman packed off to South Africa? And why did the ship's log go down with the ship? Why did Captain Smith accelerate into the ice field of which he had been warned so many times? Why did he wait 25 minutes to start the pumps that could have saved the ship? The book reveals Smith's astonishing accident records and exposes the White Star Line as having one of the worst safety records on any transatlantic shipping line. And I remember from reading this book that they go after Captain Smith with hammer and beat. That's hilarious. Every time he so much as scuffed the paint on a boat under his command, they give it a whole angry paragraph. But let's go on. There's more. Oh, there's much more. What caused the hole near the bow? The iceberg cracked the plates along the ship's side, but this hole looks like the result of, say it with me now, an explosion. Why is the position of the wreck irreconcilable with the Titanic's final SOS calls? Was the Titanic replaced at the last minute by her sister ship, the already damaged Olympic, in a plot to recover the huge losses she ran up? It would have required little more than switching a few nameplates. And more. The Dust Jacket promises lots more. There are lots of unanswered questions about the Titanic. Now, I love the subject of the Titanic. I've made a pretty extensive study of it. It's one of those little linchpin things in history that I find just endlessly interesting. The Titanic would be one of those. Custer's Last Stand is another one of those. The Jack the Ripper murders is another one of those. These little sigils in history that don't necessarily mean much on their own. They have all been conscripted at one point or another to mean something more than what they did. I've seen people say that Custer's Last Stand was the beginning of the American Civil War. I've seen people say that the sinking of the Titanic was the end of Gilded Age innocence. I've seen people say, many people say that the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 in Whitechapel were the beginning of the modern era, and so on and so forth. It's very easy to do that kind of thing. It's almost never inarguably true. It's almost always something that you could take severe issue with. It's not the same thing as, for instance, saying the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the beginning of World War One. Franz Ferdinand getting shot in Sarajevo was the beginning of World War One. That it is a sigil event, but it is also the start of something. Whereas these other things, they can be employed for almost any reason. I find them fascinating, just endlessly fascinating. I've read so much on the Titanic, so much bad fiction, and so much great history. There's so many good books on this subject, all aspects of it. This is not one of those. This is not one of those. This is a frothing at the mouth, lunging at the leash conspiracy theory volume packed to the gills with lunacy. But I love it all the more for that. I love it all the more for that. This and the first poets are the ones on this pile that most severely tempt me to just jump right in. I could easily see myself doing with this book, just going right into this and not really caring how much time I have to waste, although I have to care. In my work, in writing, I intentionally leave myself buffer zones. You know, one of the advantages of being a freelance writer is that you don't report to an office. And therefore, your time is largely unstructured. It's largely your own to structure. Now, that is sounds far more alluring when you say it than it actually is in reality. Because if you don't impose some structure on your time, you're not going to be a very remunerative freelance writer. You're going to be a bad freelance writer. So, but nevertheless, there's an element of freedom there that, for instance, I didn't get during all those years working in retail bookstores. I had a ball. Don't get me wrong. The sheer rollicking, side-splitting adventures that Deb and I had in that raggedy old store for all those years, tormenting the kids, the new people as they came in, mystifying the managers because they couldn't understand what we were talking about, because we were talking about some book deal that we saw on a bargain shelf in a store that doesn't exist anymore, that we saw 20 years ago in a store that doesn't exist anymore. And most of all, the sheer symphony that happened during the lunch rush from noon to 2 every weekday. The sheer symphony where a whole bunch of disparate people, some of whom aren't alive anymore, who had been sniping and griping at each other all morning long, suddenly at 10 past noon, when hordes of customers started coming in and making the whole store busy, but especially the information desk, where they mobbed because this was before the internet. They couldn't come up with these answers at their desk. When all of a sudden the staff that had been at each other's throats and griping and carousing with each other would suddenly cohere and play off each other and field off to each other and finish each other's sentences until 10 past 2, and then we would lapse back into the island of misfit toys. I wouldn't pass that up at all, but those of you who work in retail will already know the downside of that. You get, I was going to list a whole bunch of downsides, but actually the downside to working in retail can be summed up in one word: managers. In addition to all that fun, I also had an almost unbroken string of little tin dictator idiot managers who needed to be paper trained, needed to have the rolled newspaper over the nose, needed to be put in their place once in a while, sometimes in public, sometimes in front of customers, just so they'd know the lay of the land, and who, depending on how much power they had, could be an annoyance, a genuine annoyance. And you couldn't just say, to hell with this. Because you work in retail, you've got your schedule's laid out for the next 2 weeks. You say, to hell with this, you're out of a job. Whereas with freelancing, that isn't true. It isn't true to that straight-laced an extent. If I build in cushions, like for instance, if I have 3 assignments and I finish one of them at 10 in the morning, and I think, you know what I could do? I could do the other 2 right now. If I do the other 2 right now, then suddenly a week opens up without any pressing deadlines. And wouldn't that be nice? To read a little bit more, to dive into books like this with a little bit more unstructured time, maybe to work on longer projects. I do that. I do that quite a bit, but nevertheless, I can't afford, almost literally, to just sink into the couch with Frida on my belly and read 300 pages of this thing. I will dip into it. Very controlled. And then the last book I want to show you for this OGBG Warfare Haul is The Find of the Day, and a perfect demonstration of the Brattle will provide. It's this. It's John Quincy Adams and the Foundations of American Foreign Policy by Samuel Flagg Bemis. This is 1 volume of his 2-volume biography of John Quincy Adams. It is brilliant. Absolutely scintillatingly fantastic. It's totally detailed. It's buried in detail. It's buried in historical grounding, as you'd expect from this. This author he is America's premier historian of diplomacy and the history of the annals of diplomacy. He wrote a multi-volume, like 20-volume series about secretaries of state and the various impacts that they had on American diplomacy, and a whole bunch of other books as well. Was the dean of the subject, and he wrote 2 volumes on John Quincy Adams, this one and the following one. And this is the Foundations of American Foreign Policy. And you think, okay, you might think, if you don't know anything about John Quincy Adams, you might think, well, that's a little strange. Shouldn't there be a volume before that about his youth? If you're saying this is the subtitle, then this book is all about his career as a diplomat, which spanned decades. And you'd be right about that. But the wrong part is that he is underestimating what a freak he was. Of all the Adamses were all freakish. But John Quincy Adams was the greatest freak of them all. And his diplomatic career started when he was 7. It was around the time that he was 7 or 8 that his father, John Adams, realized that John Quincy was smarter than he was. It was around the time that John Quincy was 11 or 12 that John Adams and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson all realized that John Quincy was smarter than any of them. that he was a true freak of nature. And Bemis makes a great observation in this book and the other book in the sequel to this. He makes a great observation, which is that John Quincy Adams' life had 2 distinct periods to it, and they are separated by a boring little interval in which he was president of the United States. It is absolutely true. There's a long period of Adams' life where he is characterized by foreign relations, by being an internationalist, by figuring out America's stance in the world and letting the world know it in stunningly eloquent prose and also in person. First as a super hottie and then as a curmudgeon-y old man. And then there's the presidency, and then he goes back to Congress and fights a whole bunch of different fights with the abandon and the caustic wit of someone who no longer has to chase a constituency. He knew perfectly well his constituency back in Massachusetts would elect him forever. So he was free to be a pure parliamentarian in an era when it was as unlikely then as it was today. The closest equivalent in terms of that pressure not being there that you would get today, although not in terms of eloquence and not at all in terms of courage, would be somebody like Mitt Romney, who's in the U.S. Senate, knows that his seat is secure. He cannot be primaried. He cannot be beaten. His electorate will re-elect him as long as he wants to go back to Congress. And he was almost president. He was a pretty successful presidential candidate. So he has that added to him. that's where the comparison stops, of course. But John Quincy Adams, that the two halves of his life are captured perfectly in these two books. And the reason why it's the find of the day, I have my props ready. The reason why it's the find of the day is because last year or the year before that, I hauled this, John Quincy Adams and the Union. I may have even done a book repair video about on this volume. This is Bemis's other book. It's the other volume in this John Quincy Adams biography. And when I got it at the Brattle, my first thought was, well, it'd be great to have both of them, but the Brattle will provide. Sooner or later, the Brattle will provide. Whoever got rid of this to the Brattle got rid of the other volume as well. No one would have one and not the other. And no one would get rid of one and not the other. Just have to wait. In this case, it was a very long wait, but I'm glad I did, because now I have both of them. Although, you might be wondering, I'm calling this biography of John Quincy Adams great. So does that mean it's the one that I prefer? Well, no, I have another prop here of the one that I prefer. It's this. It's John Quincy Adams' Militant Spirit by James Traub. And not the hardcover. The hardcover is a pile of crap. The hardcover is for losers. You don't want to be a loser, do you? The paperback has blurbs. There's one from the aforementioned Sean Lentz. There's also one from Open Letters Monthly. Nice, generous one from Open Letters Monthly, from yours truly. So you've got the Wall Street Journal, and you've got Fareed Zakaria, and you've got Sean Lentz. Sure. Right. Also Rands, but good effort. But you also have a blurb by me on the paperback. So that is the John Quincy Adams biography to have. Because the fact that my blurb is on the paperback means that I not only wrote the book, but I am better than John Quincy Adams. I think we can all agree on that, can't we? All right, good. Let's move on. So there you go. That was my Brattle skirmish haul for today. A good haul, all lots and lots of history. I'm not sure, of course, in the back of my mind, I always wonder with every one of these Brattle hauls, how many are keepers? I'm not 100% sure of that. Some of these are. The John Quincy Adams thing obviously is. It'll go on the shelf with the other volume, probably with a bit of rereading. And there are other things on here too that I will probably keep, but we shall see. We shall see. I'm going to fill this bookcase in this room, and then at the end of the year, if I'm still here, if any of us are still here, I will assess. So we have John Quincy Adams and the Foundations of American Foreign Policy. This is the first volume of Bemis's two-volume biography of Quincy Adams. Then we have the Titanic Conspiracy. Might as well be plural. How many mysteries are there of the Titanic? Why isn't the ship where it belongs? Why was the log lost with the ship? Or was it? Then we have the Peloponnesian War by Don Kagan. First-rate narrative history. We have the First Poets, the premier temptation of this haul, the one that I want to read right away. We have The Age of Reagan by Sean Lentz. We have The Age of Voltaire by Will and Ariel Durant, which is about far more than Voltaire. And we have from the journals of MFK Fisher, all sorts of nonfiction of hers, which I admit I like a lot more than her fiction, although her fiction is still beautifully written. And plenty of the greatest novelists of the 20th century routinely said of her fiction and her nonfiction, this is better prose than anything I can write. This is better prose than anything I've read all year, and on the side I review books. This is just unearthly good. Any of you who've read her will probably agree with that. So there you go. That's a Brattle haul. Who knows when another will be necessary. All I'm trying to do is liberate the Sudetenland. But I shall wrap this up for now and wait to see what countermeasures are taken. But I will see you soon. Thank you, Book 2, and remain vigilant.